like to introduce myself as a person who is in the middle of a shift, literally and metaphorically. Basically, I'm a publisher. I run this small little imprint for children and young adults called Young Zuban, which is itself a small part of a small publishing house, independent feminist publishing house called Zuban. And I've spent the last 20-something, 25 years of my life basically editing other people's work. I'm an editor. I'm basically an editor. But a couple of years ago, I had a bit of a shift in my thinking and a bit of a revelation that, and a kind of an unexpected one at that maybe I can also write. Maybe I can also write fiction, in fact. And there are, that whole creative journey from being someone who critiques and edits someone else's writing, and today we're going to be specifically talking about fiction, to being a creative writer oneself, is a very, has been for me a very interesting and unexpected journey. And it's made me think a lot about why we do read fiction. I mean, what is fiction all about, actually? And what it does to our brains. And why it's important. I always had this kind of gut feeling that reading novels was a very important thing to do. I mean, I'm sure all of you, like your teachers, are always saying, yeah, you got to read, you got to be an avid reader, you got to join the reading club, reading is good. I talk in a lot of schools, and in almost every school I go to, they're like, oh, a publisher, reader, you must encourage the children to read because children don't read anymore. I used to read a lot, they say. I don't believe them. But, and then there's always this one horrible sentence, the horriblest phrase in the whole of horrible phrases, which is, inculcate the reading habit into the minds of young children. And it's like, oh God, I really don't want to be inculcated with anything. Go away. It sounds painful and uncomfortable and might possibly leave you, walking like this. So, I'm not really talking about inculcating anything into your young minds, don't worry. But what I do want to get you to think about maybe is why we read fiction or why we write fiction, because I'm sure a lot of you in the audience would also be avid writers as well as readers or potential writers. And it seemed to me to boil down to this one little question or one little thought, one little shift, if I can go back to the shift, which is you take a very boring two-word, very small sentence like what is, and you knock off the last letter and you put an F there instead. And you come up with a really interesting sentence, which is what if. And I think that is really where the creative process of starting to write fiction begins. And once you have that question in your mind, what if, you're then in the realm of fiction. You're then looking at the world around you and saying, okay, this is how things are, but what if they were different? What if, I don't know, what if I found out that my dad was actually a Greek god? What would that be like, right? What if my dog suddenly turned out to have superpowers? Was, like a canine spy? What if that really, really cute guy at the back of the class who never says anything, what if he's a vampire, right? So, and then once you start thinking about that, as a writer, you really, really, really have to stay with that. You have to follow that through. You say, okay, if that guy is a vampire, then what is he like? Where does he come from? How did he become a vampire? What can he do that normal people can't? What if he fancies me? Am I going to be a vampire? Are we allowed to kiss? What happens to our baby? I mean, it's just all like, you really have to start thinking through. So you start with a fundamental kind of what if, and then as a writer, you then have to construct this whole world in which that what if, which is made up, becomes, for your reader, a what is. It becomes like a good piece of successful fiction makes you honestly really believe that this is how the world works in this book. And what's great about fiction is you open that book and you jump right into that world, and you have a sense of confidence in the writer's ability to having done all the thinking for you. So they've constructed all the bits of that world. They've thought through those characters so well that you feel like you really know them, or that you're about to get to know them really well, and they're real people. So, I mean, one of the things that I completely adore about J.K. Rowling, for example, is that you ask anyone in the room, like, can you disapparate out of Hogwarts or into Hogwarts? And they're like, no, of course you can't. You can't disapparate. I mean, it's just not allowed. So it's like, okay, that is not, I mean, that's not a real place. How do we all know that that is a fixed rule in the world of magic, that you cannot apparate and disapparate out of Hogwarts? It's because Rowling has thought about this whole, she must have started with a what if. What if magic existed in our current world? Okay, so there would have to be a way of kind of having it in this parallel world that was so that muggles like us didn't know that it was there. So then you have to have a Ministry of Magic, you have to have obviously training facilities to teach spells and all of that kind of stuff. So then there was Hogwarts, and then there was this. So the big what if in J.K. Rowling's head, she had to do a hell of a lot of work to make that into a what is. And what's great about the Hogwarts and the Harry Potter series, I think, and the reason that I read them again and again, is that you know that those rules in that book, the way that that world works is, you know, really rock solid. And you enjoy going there because you don't ever feel like it's fiction. You feel like, oh, I'm in that world. So there are two basic thing, and I've only got, oh God, there's this timer here, which is like really, I feel like when it gets down to 0, I shall just take off like a rocket. They'll just blow me out of the stage. So I shall talk fast. There are two basic things, I think, that are the reason why, okay, 3, and maybe 4. Okay, we'll start at 2, and then we'll see how much time we have. There are two basic things about why reading fiction and writing fiction, I think, are really, really, really good skills to have, and really something that I think everyone should do. Maybe not writing, because some people are really terrible and they send me their proposals and I have to say no, and that hurts me. But reading fiction, I think, does 2 big things. One is to do with, or writing fiction, having anything to do with fiction, thinking about fiction. One is to do with basically imagining alternate realities. Now, it sounds very space agey, but actually it's, I think, a skill that all of you young people and old people and all people need to do in order to change any kind of reality that we have. If you're a good creative writer and you want to make the what if in your head, the fictional world in your head, as believable as possible, you need to do a lot of thinking about, testing your ideas against, questioning. What if, what if, what if? And only once you've really got a sense that this world that you have created is working, those kind of processes in your brain are actually a way of almost scientifically, without the lab and without the alternate reality simulator, testing out how a different world might work. And for anyone who's looking at the world that we currently have, with its violence and with its prejudice and with its running out of fossil fuels and with its global warming and with its political inequalities and with its horror and its sadness, will want to think about how a future world might look that may not have these things. How would that be? What would the people be like in that world who would be able to have that world? So in a sense, creating a fiction, you're thinking about an alternate reality, and I think that that is a hugely important thing for anyone to do, and particularly for young people to do, because you're going to have to live it. The other thing that I think fiction does, which is a very, very, also very important thing, is that it teaches us how to be empathetic. there are basically two kinds of empathy. Oh, actually, can anyone give me a working definition of empathy, or how empathy and sympathy are different? Anyone? Oh, come on. Yeah, empathy. Yes. Good. Shout. Oh, don't shout.
Sympathy means just feeling pity about something and just maybe just thinking over it just like that.
Mm-hmm.
And empathy is putting ourselves in those shoes and trying to experience what that person is really going through.
Very good. Is that right? Are we clapping? Very good. Thank you. So, yeah, that basically nails it. If I see a child in pain and I think, oh, poor kid, and I feel sympathy. If I see a child in pain and I feel that hurt within me, that's more like empathy. And there are two kinds of empathy, actually. There's cognitive empathy, where you can understand someone's point of view that is not your point of view. It's where you, like you say, put yourself in someone else's shoes, you see the world through their eyes. And then there is affective empathy, where you actually feel what they're feeling to a certain extent. And there's been a huge revolution in thinking about empathy, I think. A lot of evolutionary biology from the 19th century onwards really was saying, okay, we as a species have evolved survival of the fittest. We evolve in order to serve our best interests. But recently, a lot of biologists and also in neuroscience, in how the brain works, have decided that actually a large part of what we are and who we are and how we are is empathetic creatures, that we have neurons in our brain, or in fact, not just mirror neurons, which are these neurons that mirror someone else's emotional reaction, but an actual kind of circuitry within the brain, which allows us to experience something of what someone else is feeling. And that seems to be hardwired into who we are. So, in fact, Barack Obama, in his election campaign, in the run-up to his election campaign, said that the biggest problem facing the US electorate was not fiscal deficit. It wasn't to do with a lack of money, but it was to do with a lack of empathy. So he called it empathetic deficit, which I rather like as a phrase. And that the big social plan, call to arms almost, that he said was that we have to deal with our empathy deficit. We have to, once you start thinking of others, seeing another person's point of view, and there is really no better way to do that than to read a book of fiction where you feel that you are inside the head of that other character. And that really, for me, is the test of a really satisfying piece of fiction, is that you feel like, oh my God, I am that person. I know what they're feeling. And they have also done, there's been a whole bunch of studies about how people who are reading emotionally involving stories fire up those neurocircuits in the brain much more effectively than if you're watching something on screen, where there's much more sympathy for the characters, but there's not that level of identification. So empathy is something which I think helps us. It helps you be kind of better, more understanding person in your personal relationships. But I think it also is, it has an incredible transformative power, because once we think about someone else's needs and someone else's pain or someone else's joy or someone else's understanding of a problem, we're much more likely to form alliances, we're more likely to understand each other, there's going to be more dialogue, and that's where the real revolution begins. And that all comes from reading Vampire Diaries. Yeah, that's where my argument kind of falls down a bit, but you get what I'm saying. And the timer is now at 0, so I'm going to be shot from this blue dot into space. But thank you very much for listening.